Hi everyone and welcome back to the garden. It's a beautiful evening here. The sun was shining till literally I pressed that record button. The trees are full of birds singing away and everything in the garden is looking its biggest and its best. The garden's full of flowers like the gingers there. The colocasia leaves are getting bigger and bigger. But I decided it's time to do my first video looking at overwintering. How to look after your tropical garden and these exotic plants through the colder UK months. It's certainly no time to panic. We're still in September, so there's hopefully 6 weeks plus of good weather still to come. But equally, it's good to be prepared, especially if you're new to tropical gardening or you picked up a lot of new plants this year. All those impulse buys that I know a lot of you have bought. It's great to know a few care tips to keep them going through the winter months so you get even bigger and better plants next year. What at first then looks like an exotic jungle that would never make it through the winter months is in reality a careful mixture of a lot of different kinds of plants. And when you sort of categorise them in your head, it definitely makes winter care so much easier. So just to go through it quickly, in the garden here, like many tropical style gardens in cooler climate countries, there's a hardy backbone of really tough, usually evergreen plants that keep that exotic vibe going through the coldest winter months. Those, I'm looking at the Trachycarpus palms, really tough palms that add to that exotic vibe but don't need any sort of protection and should be fine in 95% of UK locations in 95% of winters. Bamboos as well, there's some really tough varieties that go down to maybe minus 20 degrees C but can take a serious amount of cold. Then there's plants that do stay outside all year, plants like the tree ferns, Dicksonia antarctica, that might need some protection. Maybe just a bit of straw in the crown, but potentially wrapping if it gets colder. And again, they should be tough and hardy in most places, but you do need to give them a little bit of extra care. Musabastu, a banana plant. I still think it's crazy to this day that you can grow bananas in the UK and have them growing outside all year. But the reality is, in most places, with a mild winter, you wouldn't even need to wrap them. Realistically, if we don't have a mild winter, then a bit of wrapping should keep that height through to next year, and come next May, they'll start growing away again. Following those, you've got the plants that you do need to bring in, either into a polytunnel or greenhouse or inside over the winter months. So you've got plants like cannas, dahlias that grow from tubers, rhizomes, and those here personally, I do dig them up and just keep them in a cool greenhouse or polytunnel, just ticking over frost-free for the colder winter months, and they do absolutely fine, really easy. And then you've got the more temperamental, high-maintenance plants like Ensete and Colocasia, that you might need to either bring inside and dry store or grow as houseplants. Max, our little parrot dog's come out to join me. I think he heard the ice cream van and is wanting a good post to look out over the whole garden. I suppose there is a fifth group as well, the plants that you grow from seed. The annuals that you plant in early spring or maybe early summer even. They grow, they flower, they do the thing, and then you compost them. You don't need to worry about those. There's plants like ricinus that they're not really annuals as such, but they're just not worth overwintering because they grow so quickly. Right, let's put him down. So those are roughly the main groups of plants that grow here, and I will cover some of the key plants in more specific videos closer to the time. But today, to kick off the overwintering series, I wanted to look at 5 common overwintering mistakes. Just as that summer ice cream van's roaring past, I wanted to look at 5 mistakes. These are either common misconceptions or mistakes that I've made myself and have learnt from bitter experience, the easiest and the lowest maintenance way of hopefully guaranteeing these exotics making it through the winter. So, kicking off with the first mistake, and it's starting to overwinter too early. It's great to be prepared and it's great not to leave everything till the last minute rush, but equally the worst single thing you can do is wrap everything up and protect everything too early. You really want to wait till just before the cold actually hits, when you start to see those temperatures less than 5 degrees. It varies plant by plant, but you don't want to be doing everything as soon as the 1st October hits, taking everything inside. You really want to minimise the amount of time that any plant spends either inside, dry, or kept in a polytunnel. You want to keep them outside growing for as long as you physically can. Some years it can be early October. You can have 2 degrees and sleet like we did a couple of years ago on the first week in October, and other years it can potentially push into mid-late November and hopefully for some plants even into December, but we don't really know what this year is going to bring. I won't go through every single plant in the garden in this video, but all I would say is, rather than just looking at how you overwinter a plant, it's worth noticing when people do it too. So go in the Facebook groups, or if you're old school, look at the forums, see when people protect certain plants. And the reality is, other than the really tender ones, or your house plants, a lot of people really like to leave it as late as possible before they wrap plants. And the main reason for that is, while a plant's growing outside, it is still growing, no matter how slow. It's not going downhill. Whereas if you wrap a plant, it does create problems. And probably the worst thing you can do is to wrap a plant for too long. In terms of the plants that you take inside then, any time that they spend inside the house or the polytunnel, it's time spent either growing in a suboptimal environment, or being dry stored for longer than they need to and actually shrinking down, or it's time that they might actually be rotting. So you really want to minimise that time as much as you possibly can. And when it comes to the plants that stay outside, like the Musa basjou, that are wrapped for months on end, you don't want to have them wrapped up for longer than they need to be. So you really want to wait until those first light frosts start to hit and then wrap them. Because if you have them wrapped longer, again, it really increases the chance of them actually rotting away. You might think you're doing the best thing possible for your tree ferns by wrapping them up as soon as October comes, protecting them from any winter cold. But the reality is they're tougher than you realise, and if you completely wrap the plant and chop those fronds off, you're actually doing the worst thing for it. Because then the plant won't get as much water as it needs, those fronds won't be collecting the energy from that winter sun, and also the plant might end up having a narrow crown due to those old fronds being chopped off. So really it's a case of only protect things for the minimum amount of time possible that you actually need to protect them. And that varies from the plants that go inside for the winter months to those that only need protection during the absolute coldest spells. Try to only give protection when you absolutely need to. It's probably easier just to say enjoy your autumn garden for as long as you possibly can, but the reality is the best single thing you can do to improve your chances of plants making it through the winter is actually minimise the amount of time you spend overwintering them. On to my second mistake, which is a more easy practical one, it's don't wrap things in plastic. So when I say wrapping plants, there's those that get wrapped for months at a time. The Musa basjou, potentially your tree ferns, and then there's those that only get a bit of protection thrown over them during the very coldest nights. And for both those groups of plants, you don't want to use plastic. And I know it's one of the things you see recommended on the internet, use bubble wrap to wrap your plants and it traps all that extra warm air in. The reality is, it does very little in that respect. It doesn't insulate a lot, but what it does do is trap all that moisture inside. And if there's one thing that kills plants faster than cold, it's combining that cold with humidity. It just leads to fungal problems and plants rotting away. And probably the most affected by this will be palms. The worst thing you can do for a palm in your garden, even one that's affected by the cold like Washingtonia maybe, is actually just wrap it up. They really need that airflow, that fresh air blowing through them. Maybe some overhead cover will be good, or maybe wrapping it up on the very coldest nights. But you really again want to minimise the amount of time it's spent wrapped and don't use plastic. All you're doing is creating the ultimate wet, cold environment where humidity is going to go sky high and it'll cause so many problems that actually lead to your plant losing leaves or potentially even dying. So the best thing you can do is to use something breathable. And the main material used is actually fleece, horticultural fleece. I'll go through some of the best kinds in a video I've got coming up. But essentially, whilst it's still made of plastic, it is breathable. So you can use it to wrap your Musa basjou bananas, but it still lets some of that airflow come. It doesn't just trap all the moisture inside, and at least some of it does escape. So whilst there isn't a perfect product, there is something that I'm looking at that I hope is going to be a slight step in the right direction over fleece, but I'll do a video on that closer to the time. The best thing you can do is use something like fleece, use straw to pack it with, don't use any plastic, and certainly don't wrap your plants in bubble wrap. There are a couple of exceptions that I'll let you get away with. Maybe if you've got a Musa basjou clump, you've packed it full of straw, you've wrapped it in fleece, you mount a bit of plastic just on the top to keep the worst of that winter rain out. That's quite important. And also, if you've got a pot that's maybe ceramic or something that's glazed, again, if you want to wrap that in bubble wrap, it might just give that root ball a bit of extra protection. But certainly don't wrap the whole plant in plastic, it won't thank you for it. Following very closely on from points 1 and 2 then is mistake 3, and it's going too far and overwrapping your plants. It's protecting plants that don't need the protection. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, a lot of the plants in a tropical garden, they are really tough. Certainly in most UK gardens, in most winters, they should be absolutely fine. The bamboos, the trachycarpus, the phormiums, the cordylines, plants like that should be very tough, and unless there's a real exceptional cold spell, you shouldn't need to do anything. And the reality is, if you put too much TLC onto them, if you actually wrap them up, you're more likely to cause more harm than good. So it's important to find out which plants in your garden are the really tough, hardy ones by someone who maybe grows in a similar area to you. Obviously, there's no point living in Scotland and going off what someone in Cornwall says, because they've got a very different climate to you. But find someone in your area or someone that lives in a similar kind of region, see what they do and learn from other people's mistakes. And if there is a plant that's hardy, then don't worry about wrapping it, because if you wrap it, you're more likely to cause problems, maybe breaking leaves off, breaking fronds off, or again trapping that humidity inside and risk causing rot when you absolutely don't need to. The fourth mistake then, it's a very plant specific one, but one that I see mentioned a lot on social media, and it's tree ferns, not watering over the winter months. And the reality is, plants like tree ferns, they might come from the other side of the world, but they come from a climate that is actually quite similar to the UK's, in that it's quite mild and experiences a lot of rainfall. So during those cold winter spells, it can often be dry for weeks on end. You do need to keep your tree ferns watered. Maybe not every day like in summer, but certainly maybe twice a week. That's what I do here. Every few days, if it hasn't rained, I give the trunks a good soak in. And obviously, exceptions to this are, maybe not obvious, but if it's going to be frosty or a very cold night below freezing, I wouldn't water the plant. But certainly during the milder spells, it can be mild and it can be dry, and it's during those spells that you absolutely need to keep them watered. Keep them happy, keep them healthy, and I have heard that more tree ferns actually die due to not being watered in winter than actually down to the cold. So potentially that could be true, but certainly if you want the biggest fronds next year and the happiest, healthiest tree fern, the best thing you can do is keep that watering consistent through the year. One thing I do change though during the winter months is I don't water directly into the crown, I just water the trunk. And that's because there's new fronds there that are sat ready to unfurl next spring. Those are probably the most tender, vulnerable part of the plant. And if you pour a lot of water in there, then those are more likely to actually freeze up. But certainly for the rest of the plant, if it's not freezing, if there isn't frost forecast, then certainly give them a good soak in. The general theme of this video so far then has hopefully been one of reassurance, that you should absolutely enjoy your autumn garden for as long as possible. Leave your plants growing, enjoy the autumn sun, and don't worry about them until you absolutely have to. And when it does come to protecting them, only use the smallest amount of protection possible, protect them for the shortest time, and if they don't need it, don't protect them. A little bit of knowledge and the right materials, you can look after your garden so much more efficiently, and you've got a lot better chance of getting your plants through to next year. But my fifth mistake is actually going off suppliers' quoted hardiness ratings. It's the other way. Sometimes you can buy plants and see -12, -15 degrees quoted and think that your plant can take that, when the reality is a lot of these figures, they're not necessarily accurate. I know the reality is that if you're watching this video, you're more likely to want to protect your plants and you're more likely to overprotect them in winter than underprotect, and that's why most of this video has been targeted at that. But also, I know some of you might have bought plants this year that had labels on them that say -12, -15. For example, Butea odorata, a feather palm, quite tough and very cold tolerant. You might see -9 quoted, maybe -10, but will your plant actually take that and keep growing? The reality is probably not. And without wanting to cause concern, all I'm wanting to say is look around, see other people in your area. Do other people grow that plant? If so, ask them how they've got on with it. Do you see big ones in your local area? In which case it should be absolutely fine. But if you can't see any evidence of these plants surviving for years around you, if you don't know anyone local that grows them, then go on Facebook, go in the groups like Tropical Style Gardening UK, find out what other people do with those plants. I always think that a few words of wisdom from maybe someone who's actually grown that plant in the UK means so much more than just a hypothetical figure on a label, especially a label that's designed to sell a plant to you. There's a lot of good companies out there that really know the stuff, that sell the exotics and know they're actually proven in the UK, and there's a lot of companies that just want to sell the plants. So it's important to really question that minus figure. And some plants, we'll go back to the example of the Butea odorata. It might say -10 on that label, but like I said, it might not actually take that in your garden, because that is the absolute life or death figure for an adult version of that plant, grown somewhere in optimal conditions, good drainage, lots of winter sun, and really warm summers. Here in the UK, as this year's shown, we definitely don't have that. So the reality is that -10, that's maybe when the plant will actually die, but it can certainly take damage before that, a good few degrees before it. And here in the UK, as we don't have those hot summers and those mild winter spells that really get the plants actually growing, that damage can take a long time to grow out. So it's not just about protecting the plant from death. For me, it's about having a plant that's worth looking at the following year. It's always worth protecting just a bit before that and not just blindly see -10 and thinking, I don't need to worry most winters. And the other thing is, If you grow a plant in a climate like the UK that's got more winter rain, then that instantly takes away from its hardiness, because that hardiness figure is often quoted for a dry place with good drainage. That really improves how much cold they can take. Here in the UK, where it's definitely going to be wetter and there's not a lot you can do about that, that plant won't be quite as tough. And probably the biggest factor is, if you grow that plant in a pot, or if it's a small version of that plant, it's nowhere near as hardy as those figures suggest. So as a very rough rule, personally for a smaller plant, I take a good few degrees off that. And if it's grown in a pot, I take a few more degrees off it too. So the reality is, your protection might need to start a good bit before the label actually suggests. I obviously can't go through every single plant in the garden in this video, but it's more of a general word of advice really, that if you picked up a new plant this year, if it's some exotic plant that you'd never heard of before you got into this style of gardening, if it's a plant you haven't seen grown in gardens locally, maybe it's worth just finding out other real world experiences, because like I said, the experience of someone who's actually tried growing that plant in the UK, who knows what it can take in winter, who knows whether it's worth protecting it or you're best off just leaving it, that advice means so much more than just a hypothetical figure. You might be old school and enjoy going through books to learn more about the plants. You might like going in forums like Growing on the Edge, that's really great back in the day. Hardy Tropicals, there's still some posts up there. Or maybe Facebook, go in the groups, use the search function, type in the name of the plant and find out other people's overwintering experiences, because it might just surprise you at how much or how little protection your plant actually needs. So that's my first overwintering video over, and I hope the series of videos that I got planned, they really help you look after your garden as efficiently and effectively as possible and give you the best chance of keeping these amazing plants growing in your garden next year. But I will just end on one bonus mistake. This is mistake 6, and it's not leaving enough room to overwinter your plants. But unfortunately I can't give any advice on this mistake. It's one that I make every single year, and chances are if you grow exotic or tropical plants you will make this mistake too. I guarantee you, if you've got a greenhouse, no matter what the size, it will be full. If you've got a polytunnel, it will be full. And whilst I personally don't push the boundaries too much, if you've got a kitchen, if you've got a bathroom, it might even be full too. There's absolutely no advice I can give on that. But hopefully there's been some helpful tips in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.